Thank you everyone again for joining our webinar today. And before we get started, we would just like to acknowledge that the land on which Canada Helps operates is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Toronto is home to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community and on this land. My name is Sandra, and I'm a Digital Marketing Associate at Canada Helps. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Kris Archie, Executive Director of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, who will be presenting today's webinar on reconciliation and Indigenous peoples. Our teams have partnered together not only to produce this webinar, but also to co-publish our Reconciliation, A Call to Action for Canadians blog series, which is published on the Canada Helps Giving Life blog. As a part of the series, we take a closer look at the commitment, momentum, and urgency of reconciliation, a topic which we will be exploring today during this webinar. Later, Kris will be joined by Kevin McCort, President and Chief Executive Officer at the Vancouver Foundation, for a conversation as Kevin will share his personal, community-related, and professional experiences in engaging in reconciliation. For those of you who are new to Canada Helps is a social enterprise focused on helping charities. We provide charities with open access to our affordable online fundraising platform and training so they can better connect with the people who support them. And for donors, we offer a one-stop shop for donating and fundraising for any registered Canadian charity online. Since 2000, over 1.5 million Canadians have donated through Canada Helps, and together we've raised $780 million in donations.
Okay, you see a different slide?
Yeah, we're all good.
Great. Okay, thanks folks. Okay, so as the slide says, the Circle aims to be an open space for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together in social change to learn and engage with one another. Tomorrow we're launching the third round of our Journey to Reconciliation series with 150 acts of reconciliation diving deeper. To join us is Crystal Fraser and Sarah Comarski guide us to their list of ways to engage in reconciliation. One of the things that I would add for members of the Circle is that we have partners in the philanthropic community the honor of staying the philanthropic community declaration of action. And so we try and focus our learning journey around these 6 pieces that you see on the screen: to learn, remember, understand and acknowledge, participate, and act. Oh, hi, there's me. That's my smiling face, as it says. My name is Kris. I'm a Secwepemc and Summit woman from Sisseton First Nation. This work is really important to me because not only is this about seeing increased investment in Indigenous-led work and about building partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks here in Canada, but it's also important to me because I'm a mother and an Indigenous woman. This work of reconciliation is a lived everyday experience for me, and so I'm just really pleased that in the work that I do in the world, and I'm able to also find some real personal and values alignment. So thank you for allowing me to tell you a bit about myself. Learn and remember. Part of our work together, you was talking about the sad reality of the difficulties related to our shared history here in Canada. Can catch me off guard, but here we go. We'll go back into it. Okay. So the Truth and Reconciliation reminds and informs us that for the past 100 years, Indigenous children were removed from their families and sent to institutions called Indian residential schools. These government-funded and church-run schools were located across Canada and established with the purpose to eliminate parental involvement in the spiritual, cultural, and intellectual development of Indigenous children. The last residential school closed in the mid-1990s. During this chapter in Canadian history, more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were forced to attend these schools, some of which were hundreds of miles from their homes. The impact of these Indian residential schools is a legacy of unresolved trauma passed from generation to generation and has had a profound effect on the relationship between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians. Strongly, the efforts of all peoples are necessary to revitalize the relationship between Indigenous people and society, with reconciliation the process as a goal. It's a process that takes commitment to multiple nations. We will have a far stronger and greater nation. We believe reconciliation is important because we're at a real moment in time. Marking this year, 2017 is the 150th year of Canada's Confederation. Here is a chance to really think through how we could change our direction, our conversation, and our relationship with one another. This is really an opportunity to create a society where all peoples can flourish in spaces of dignity and respect. In order to move forward, it becomes necessary to take a step back. Sometimes it's about taking a step back and slowing down. Indigenous peoples have the capacity and knowledge to lead in the positive change on what's needed, how to engage, and where to go in this work. However, this work is not just for Indigenous Canadians. All folks need to think about how to listen and ask questions along the way. Mending the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities needs value to be placed on the culture and the experience and knowledge of Indigenous peoples, all while recognizing that changing the colony systems that are pressed require us to be active values in a place of learning and on a collective path together. So although we recognize that there's a real eagerness for individuals to begin the work of reconciliation, as mentioned previously, it's really key that we take the time, as the Philanthropic Declaration for Action also reminds us to do some learning, to recognize shared history, and also, before taking action, take time to understand the deep historical roots of conflict between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples here. There are inherent biases in past experience that must be unraveled in order to fully understand and participate in reconciliation, and before we can create a framework for engagement. Through a process of learning, we believe that you'll find an understanding, a personal connection, and then can create a foundation so that you're able to move forward in a good way. So some of the thinking that we've been doing with the circle is recognizing that before many organizations go into a place of beginning to work about, doing in their workspaces, that we need to provide some opportunities for thinking on a personal level. How is it that we can, as individuals, find personal connection to the work of our shared history? Additionally, we want to make sure that before folks kind of walk into a work setting and start chatting about what it is that they're learning and how they totally want to change everything in the offices, that they take time to cultivate some language and understanding with their family and inside of their community. We think it's important to begin with your inner circle because those are likely to be, both invigorating and challenging conversations that are important to have. Not only that, but thinking through how to have these conversations with your children provide us adults with opportunities to go slowly and mindfully and think carefully about the language we're using, all the while building up our own capacity to have conversations and to do this learning. And finally, we feel that part of the pathway that we want to continue inviting folks into is, and specifically for those of you as donors, we'd like to see that once you've done some kind of personal and some family and community-focused work, that you're able to think through what it means as a donor to give to Indigenous-led and Indigenous-focused organizations, and that you use the Indigenous Peoples category on Canada Helps to also guide your donations. Here we are. My next slide. There we go. This is a familiar fellow. Kevin McCort is the CEO of Vancouver Foundation. Kevin McCort was appointed to the presidency in September of 2013. He brings with him a wealth of energy and 30 years of experience. Kevin McCort was also a previous employer of my own, not long before I came to the Circle, and I worked at Vancouver Foundation. And what I've always appreciated about Kevin is that because of his work in international development, he brings a very nuanced understanding and has, witnessed some of the ways that reconciliation exists in the world through action and work in nonprofit and philanthropy. So I'm just really excited, Kevin, to have you join us here today.
Thanks, Kris. Really pleased to be here with you.
So I'll just let folks out in the internet know that this is an interesting way for Kevin and I to have conversation. We do occupy an office building, the same office building, and have a lot of ability to chat pretty comfortably with each other in the same room. However, for this conversation, we're in very different spaces. And so please, bear with us as we work through this more unnatural conversation here over the internet. Okay, well, to get started, Kevin, I just would like to hear more about what was your first step in engaging reconciliation, and how did it get sparked?
It's an interesting question because the first real spark in Canada was the Walk for Reconciliation that happened in Vancouver in September of 2013. It was essentially 2 weeks after I started on the job at Vancouver Foundation, and I was encouraged by the staff to join them at the walk, and it was really an extraordinary day. 70,000 people turned up in the streets right outside our office in the absolute pouring rain to demonstrate their solidarity, their interest, their willingness to stand up for reconciliation and to be involved. And so that makes a pretty profound impression on a newcomer to a city when you see so many people stepping out into a conversation that for me was very much a new one. As you mentioned, I spent 25 years working in international development in countries around the world, and often was involved in work with indigenous populations, whether it's in Botswana or Peru or Vietnam. But that international focus had really, I suppose, enabled me in some respects to pay less attention to what was happening in Canada. But that Walk for Reconciliation really was an extraordinary moment, and it's the first spark that started me on the journey of reconciliation in Canada.
Thanks for sharing that. That was quite a moment in time. I'll take this moment as well to just let folks know that there is another Walk for Reconciliation happening on the 24th, I believe. So we'll make sure that we share information. If you're in and or around Vancouver and in the area, I highly recommend that you engage in that event. So you've done international development work. You've seen, a lot of injustice and, a lack of equity in the world of this work. You talk about the experience of being on that walk. Can you share with us, just kind of personally and also professionally, when you've experienced discomfort through your journey, learning more about reconciliation?
It will be a long conversation because I experience discomfort on a regular basis. But I suppose a couple of examples to make it more real. We had our Honorary Governor's Council was meeting. This is recently, actually, and we had one member of the council talking about how he was perceiving Indigenous people and their experience post-residential schools, and it was clear he had a perception that it was really something that people could, you've probably heard this before, could get over and kind of move on with their lives, and that made all of us uncomfortable in the room. But it was an opportunity for us to have a conversation. And so what we find in these moments when someone, and this is where we're actually it's hard, it's uncomfortable. A part of you wishes, man, I wish he didn't say that. But on the other hand, you're thinking, well, this has to be a teachable moment, has to be a learnable moment. Our Indigenous colleagues that were in the room were incredibly graceful and responsive in response, which helps all of us. And it was an opportunity to take which could have been an opportunity to just ignore or gloss over, an opportunity to have a real conversation. And it's so yeah, it's been uncomfortable in many ways, but what I've found has helped me, and this something I learned a long time ago, is that when you're uncomfortable, say so. And I had an opportunity, one of our board members and friends of ours, friends of many of us, Paul Lacerte, was on our board, and I said to Paul, you know, Paul, I'm often uncomfortable in this context. I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid, you know, what I don't know will make me look ignorant or insensitive. And Paul's response is, well, Kevin, you know, I'm often uncomfortable myself dealing with, you know, people like you, settlers, that he said, I'm uncomfortable. I have the same sense of, am I going to offend? Am I going to make the situation worse? And so the two of us agreed that we would be each other's sounding board for discomfort. And that is something that I think is very helpful if you can find somebody in your life, in your circle, where you can say, you know, I'm uncomfortable and this is why, and you've shared that level of trust with them that they're able to do that with you. Personally, that for me was a great help in that, you know, navigating situations of discomfort, that you can actually learn to say, I'm uncomfortable, and that helps the conversation about moving through.
Thank you for that. That is a really clear action, you know, to pay attention to the discomfort and how it might show up even in our own bodies. And like you said, taking the opportunity to make that a teachable moment and actually just naming the discomfort and allowing for the wisdom in the room to help inform. Very, you know, I think that that's a very key aspect to how folks can bring this up, not only in a professional setting, but in a personal, you know, life setting.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I like the approach, and this was actually taught to me, is that by starting off with saying how something makes you feel, how it actually, you're not attacking someone else's position. You're starting off with a reflection of this, I'm uncomfortable, something about this is making, you start off with, actually sounds counterintuitive, but you start off by saying how it affects you, and that opens up a conversation for others to start from that space. Much more, my experience, a much more productive approach than saying, you know, what you're saying is wrong. That tends to be an opening gambit in a conversation that usually ends poorly. But by starting off by naming the discomfort in yourself, it opens up a conversation. It expresses some, you know, we're all taught that vulnerability is often the first step in learning. So acknowledge that in yourself. Don't be afraid to share it and to name it. And the conversations tend to be much richer and much more constructive afterwards.
Great. You know, the first that I had, you know, just when you were speaking was about, you know, how might you have dealt with the situation had the person hearing you responded with a message like, I don't care, that's in the past, that's not my problem. Do you have some, you know, either experience or some reflections on, you know, in those kinds of spaces, which I believe many people face in personal and professional spaces often? How might you respond then?
That's a scenario I've actually been dealing with for many, many years. And I'll, you know, in some of my international work, we would be working in communities where the issue was really focusing on women's empowerment. And you might see in a country the men saying, you know, this is not an interest of ours, we're quite happy with the way things are. And to start, whether it's reconciliation or women's empowerment or any of the rights that you may take in a rights-based approach, to start off arguing about the rights tends to lead you nowhere. So my approach is to kind of step back and talk to people about, what are your dreams and aspirations for your community? What do you want to accomplish? What, come at it from a very different perspective. And then move on to, and this takes time, it's not something that can be done in a minute, but then talk about, well, if those are your dreams and aspirations, what's stopping you from achieving them? What barriers might you need to overcome? And eventually you can get to conversations where people will say and recognize that, our community can't be whole unless all members are participating in that, and that my aspirations are not being met, and people start to realize it because their entire community is not engaged with them. So it's a long and a roundabout way, but it is ultimately a very constructive way of reaching the point where you're really guiding and facilitating a journey of learning about how a community where members of that community are excluded, are not participating, are being held outside, a community that doesn't work for even that person themselves, that their enlightened self-interest, to use a kind of an overused phrase, is a way to approach this. But there are weaknesses in that approach as well, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to all, and you shouldn't need to back into that conversation. You should be able to approach it head on. But in my experience, it's sometimes a little more nuanced approach, a little more roundabout way to get to the point, in the long run is more effective.
Great, thank you. I think that's a very interesting notion, that where we can actually begin from is maybe not on with a direct statement into the work that we are seeing, or this conversation for reconciliation, but to find an entry point that allows people to express their deepest desires for the community that they want to live in. I think that's very useful in, I think, particularly in the world of philanthropy. I think that's a wise action. So on we talked, so this is, mostly been focused a bit on work, but to go back to the middle part of the pathway, which is really about children. And I'd just like to share a bit about the conversation you might have had with your kids or your family, invigorate this conversation in those spheres of your life.
Yeah, that's been interesting and fun. My family history, my father's side emigrated to Southern Ontario in the early 1800s, even late 1700s, no one's exactly sure, and settled in Southern Ontario and slowly worked their way north, not very far north in today's terms, but from the edge of Lake Ontario to the edges of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And so that family history is one that was clearly and integrated with the settlement of Ontario by farming communities and the displacement of Indigenous communities over many years. And my family are farmers, so they're farming land in what we now know, which I didn't know when I was growing up, is Treaty 18 land in Ontario. And so we have these conversations as we learn things, and we always knew as a family that our land was, the land that we farmed was Indigenous land, but we knew it in the sense of geography. We knew it like we knew our postal code or our lot and concession number. We didn't know it as an item of history or of sociology or of impact. And it's, having that conversation about the land you grew up on and who was there before you and how they were displaced, those are conversations that really change the nature of reflection and in many cases the way that we give thanks for what we have. My mother's family emigrated to Canada from Holland after World War II, so and also settled as farmers in Southern Ontario. So lots of migration, newcomers, welcoming stories. My mother's family was not welcomed by the settler community that was there in the 40s and the 50s. Eventually, so it's lots of interesting conversations. My kids, on the other hand, are I think they often would look at me and my parents as kind of unfortunate that we had to learn these things as adults, whereas my kids are certainly, the curriculums in North Vancouver have been changed over the years. They're often, I think, in many respects ahead of me and the rest of our family in understanding both the elements of the history, but also just ways of living with diversity and ways of accepting and valuing the diversity that they grow up with in this day and age that wasn't so common in my youth and certainly in my parents. But it's been, and the other, we spend some of our summers in Quebec in an area that is Anishinaabe territory. It's just south of the Kitigan-Zibi reserve area in Quebec. So, no matter where we are, we have a conversation about the land that we find ourselves on and what its history is and how our family interacts with that. And so lots of conversations. There's never a shortage of chances to have a conversation about what's, as you pointed out earlier, to learn and reflect what's the history, how does our family interrelate with that, and ultimately what can we do in our behaviors and attitudes going forward that will make it even easier for our kids to be, reconciling in their lives.
It's amazing. I think that's in a lot of ways quite a common story. Folks recognizing or coming to recognize after being kind of original settlers, and I say original and air quotations, when there was an influx of immigration into, Canada, when people were given allotments of land for farming and for agricultural development and production. Just recently, here in British Columbia, there was a farmer who re-gifted his original allotted farmlands back to the indigenous communities from which it originally was stewarded by. And just last week when I was in Toronto, I heard a similar, reflection and a story from Patricia Thompson of the Atkinson Foundation sharing about, what it means to come to understand and know the true history of the plot of land that was given for settling, for intentional settling, in a farming or an agricultural sense, and the way in which folks are coming to build relationships with Indigenous folks more locally to do that work. So thank you for sharing that. I can imagine, at least I know that this is a reality in the conversations that I have here at home with my own son. My son is 17. I imagine that either through you or your children, you've had to have conversations about racism and about, witnessing it, acknowledging it, and or, possibly recognizing when you've participated in it, like Boo talks about this notion that we have racism in our teeth. Sometimes you just have a little bit, it's stuck in our teeth, it pops out, and you need to kind of be reminded that it's there. So could you share with us kind of how you navigate those uncomfortable situations or share a story of that?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to repeat what I was saying earlier about how naming the discomfort is useful, but naming the racism is useful when it happens. But again, so I'll tell a story. I worked for CARE for many years, CARE Canada, International Development Charity. We were working in 85 countries around the world. And at one point, when I was a CEO in Ottawa, one of our staff launched a human rights complaint against us, claiming that we were a racist organization. And I was really astounded by that. I thought, what on earth, how could this possibly happen, that someone felt that we were a racist organization in our hiring practices, when on the surface you look at the organization, you think, how could that possibly be? But it was a very uncomfortable situation. It didn't go all the way to the tribunal. We said, let's just talk about this. Something has clearly went off the rails with this person, and they've come to this conclusion that that we're a racist organization. So you can imagine how personally I was affronted by this. But when I guess it goes back to maybe Vu Lee's statement, is that it's only sometimes when someone challenges you that you might realize, oh, I'm not doing as much as I could. Maybe racism is a bit over the top in terms of the charge, but maybe we're not doing everything we can do to be as reflective of our practices. That we're look for those things that you do that maybe are unconsciously creating barriers to people of all abilities and backgrounds and interests to participate in your organization. So it's a very extraordinary moment for me, and it's made me. I've carried it with me for years, thinking that be reflective. What are you doing, consciously or unconsciously? Encourage people to challenge you. That if they set an environment where if people feel that there are practices that you're doing that are creating blockages, or there are things you could do that positive practices, be open to that, because I certainly found that for me a very strong learning moment. Hope that it's changed the practices that I employ as a leader of organizations. But it's I think it's always helpful, perhaps, when you're thinking of addressing racism, to just imagine the times when people have called you out in that respect, as opposed to the times when you've seen somebody else do it. Like, make it personal. Realize that we're all none of us are perfect, that we have our weaknesses, but don't be afraid to be challenged, because once you address them, you're a better person and a better organization as a result.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So our final question before we kind of open the floor to the bevy of questions available to us by our lovely viewers. Can you share a little bit about how you approach the Canada's 150th celebrations as someone who is kind of actively engaged both personally and professionally in reconciliation?
Yes, because that's a journey too. Certainly myself, I'm thinking, well, I was, give away my age. I was 2 years old in 1967, so I wasn't around for that. But I heard all this excitement about Canada when it was 100, and I thought, oh, my first reaction was, oh, Canada turning 150, it'll be exciting. And then that's kind of first very superficial level, and then very before I could probably say that publicly, my Indigenous friends and the conversations are like, hey, there's another perspective here. And I think before I could embarrass myself with kind of unguided enthusiasm, I was quickly reminded that it's an acknowledgement of an act of Parliament and an act of confederation, but it really has to be a moment where we use that to talk about a much broader conversation. So I was very helpfully, course corrected early on in that process to look at Canada's 150th very much as a point in time where you can reflect on the past, but ultimately use your reflections on what the past is 150 plus, as people are saying in Vancouver, to really say, what do we want the future to be, and who do we want to be involved in shaping that future. So that was a helpful correction, and it certainly informed how I think about Vancouver Foundation. Vancouver Foundation itself turns 75 next year, and so we're looking, and I'm watching and conversing with people about, Canada 150, Vancouver Foundation 75. Let's adopt a similar approach in looking at that not our birthday as the purpose of a celebration, but our birthday as an opportunity to look back at what historical stream are we part of as an institution, and who are we going to work with to focus on, perhaps our next 75 years. So I think it's been a conversation that has been really quite enriched by that perspective of take 150 as a moment in time. It's 2017. Let's have a historical, rich conversation of learning. Pay a little less attention to the actual the number of years, but focus really on the future.
That's a fantastic reflection. That wouldn't it be kind of quite amazing and exciting that, you know, this idea of Canada's 150th year of Confederation actually sparks and continues to sustain a more national conversation and a shift in behaviors and attitudes that actually allow us to look back on this in years and say, those were the days in which we started to, as a country and as folks, Indigenous and non-Indigenous living here, were ready to face our true history and ready to come to a place of being in a relationship in a very different way. And so there is something kind of very interesting about marking it and hoping that it signifies the plus, the 150 plus, as you mentioned, going forward. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm sure that it'll be the first of many down the road. And before I close out with you and hand it over, just are there any other comments you'd like to make, Kevin?
Well, just a note of thanks to you, Kris, because when I joined the foundation, you were certainly one of the people that helped me learn and navigate your work at Vancouver Foundation, helped us all. And just a personal note of thanks, and your new role at the Circle is one where I offer you, as you know, all of my support in that role, but you really just wanted to thank you and didn't do it publicly on this webinar about how much of a leader you have been in this space and how much I have learned from you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Kevin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kris and Kevin, to you both for that incredibly thought-provoking interview. And as Kris had mentioned, for our audience, we are going to take a minute and allow our audience members to enter in any additional questions for Kris and for Kevin. So we're just going to switch back over to my screen now, and we will get ready for some questions. All right, Kris, are you there? Kris?
I'm here.
Hey, awesome. So we did have some questions that already rolled in. If you're ready, we can start tackling a few of them.
Right on. Let's do this.
Awesome. So the first question we had that came in was, so how can we best be allies with Indigenous peoples? How can non-Indigenous peoples voice and show their support for the reconciliation process, and what can we do to help it move it forward?
Oof, that is a great question, and it's a question that we could spend the entire webinar talking about. There are a couple of first things that come to my mind, but what I'd like to do is hand this question over to Kevin. As a settler, as a non-Indigenous Canadian, I'd like to hear from him his thoughts, and I can add more.
Yeah, thankfully it takes a couple seconds to switch the speaker from Kris to me. It gives me time to think. It's a tough question, but I think ultimately, you know, what can we do to work? It starts with making friends. You know, whether it's Kris or Paul Lacerte or Sophie Pierre or people that I've met through work, friends of my kids' friends. I see it starts with really personal connections, and I think for many Canadians, they might think, well, how am I going to find a friend in this context? Well, a lot of people don't know or don't realize they know Indigenous people, and I would really start there and try and find people that you can learn, and so reach out to organizations, reach out to networks, book clubs, wherever you think you can find, and start personally to see, and then as organizations, so many on the phone, on the call, on the webinar, maybe working with organizations. There's a lot of things you can do proactively as organizations to address hiring, governance practices, how we show up and talk. Something that has been, for me, very important in this space has been the acknowledgments of the land and the conversations about, and making that very public. So I've got a couple of ideas there, but start with friends, start personally, act organizationally, and act publicly.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that. We do have another question here. Kris, if you're ready.
Yeah, I actually just want to add a couple of extra things to what Kevin said there.
Yeah, go for it.
So the making friends is very important, but I think it's also key to not kind of go out into the world and try and collect Indigenous people to help inform you. If you come to a place in your life where you can build that natural relationship like you were able to do, I think that's really quite a gift. However, before you even begin to engage with Indigenous communities, there's a whole range of really specific things. You could do your own research. Take the time to actually read the Indian Act. Take a look at and read through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And for those of you who are involved in the philanthropic sector, also take the time to look at the Philanthropic Declaration for Action. There are a whole range of opportunities in that reading alone to begin. Thanks.
Excellent. Actually, our second question ties perfectly into what you just mentioned, which is what can nonprofits in particular start to do to activate the reconciliation?
Yeah, so I would say my first thoughts are to do the things that I've just mentioned. I think additionally, where possible, take the time to provide training and space for conversations related to understanding anti-oppression, to allowing staff and board members and others to participate in experiential activities that help them understand and make an empathic connection to the work of to the real history, and not just to the history of Indian residential schools, but really to this broad, long history of white supremacy in Canada. We need to understand that together in order to unpack and then work together to create some shifts in behavior.
Excellent. Yeah, just even to expand on that, we have a few people actually asking a similar question. One is from the public health sector, another works at an art gallery, and another works at a library. So kind of what would you say is like the first kind of steps towards getting their own business or workplaces involved in reconciliation?
As we mentioned, the initiative. So if you're in a workplace and you have the ability to provide opportunities for your staff or board members to engage in a personal exercise of reflection and thinking about their connection to this history, I think that's very valuable. Additionally, the TRC does call on public institutions and to acknowledge the ways in which they perpetuate harm and injustice. And so the TRC calls for action is a very clear kind of map, I think, for public institutions to take a look at. And I'll hand over to Kevin for additional thoughts.
Thanks, Kris. I think there's some I really would reiterate reading the TRC calls to action. And I think the nonprofit and the charitable sector needs to recognize that we are not called out explicitly and directly in the calls to action, but that's not an excuse to say it doesn't apply to me. You know, it calls on government to do this, and it calls on the church to do that, and et cetera, et cetera. But within those calls, our sector should be called too much. That we can do that we can respond to. So having those, reading it, and you know that the call is directed at the justice system, but man, my organization can really do something there is a way to approach it. But there's also some very great things that we've been involved with. That one was, we call them kitchen table dialogues, and processes. Reconciliation Canada and our staff helped us through these. They're actual processes that organizations can do with their staff to learn and explore. Another one I would really recommend looking into is the Kairos blanket exercise. So there are exercises you can do and processes and templates that organizations can follow that they can engage themselves, their staff in, their partners to, as Kris mentioned, kind of experiential, that you read and do the intellectual work, but it's nice to have these other exercises where people are actively involved and engaged in learning in a different way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kevin. So just moving on to the next question here, going in a little bit of a different direction. What role do non-Indigenous youth, including young children, so starting from an early age, have to play in the reconciliation process?
Well, I like this question because it reminds me of the statement that Kevin made about his own children kind of feeling bad for the older generation because we just, people didn't know what they didn't know. And I actually feel incredibly hopeful about this next generation of young people and young leaders because in the work that I've done kind of presently in the past, I've been so privileged to bear witness to the ways in which racialized newcomer immigrant young people and settler young people are really digging in to learn the history. And, I was just having a conversation very early this morning about with a colleague for whom I've done a lot of youth work alongside over the past 15 years. And we just had this total beautiful moment of acknowledgement that the young people that we're working with more and more have some amazing critical analysis and are very deeply involved in building genuine relationships for, through school and through their extracurricular activities. And I think that those genuine relationships are what will help contribute to the kind of country that really acknowledges its shared history and also continues to make more and more space for Indigenous peoples here. Do you add anything?
Yes, just a way of an example. I was at Vancouver Foundation. We have a program called Fresh Voices, and it is focusing on the priorities and ideas of immigrant and refugee youth. We had an opportunity to facilitate a meeting between our Fresh Voices team and the Ministry of Citizenship, Immigration, and Refugees. And so we were able to get the meeting, but we were also more than happy to kind of get out of the way. And the conversation that I had with this group of immigrant and refugee youth left me almost in tears because I was so happy and impressed and proud of the intelligence and the compassion and the enthusiasm that the group expressed of how they wanted to be involved in building a Canada based on principles of reconciliation and inclusion and equity and justice. It was just stunning. And so you come out of that thinking both profoundly relieved, I suppose, from a generational perspective, as the kids are all right approach, and you're left with the overwhelming sense that, man, do whatever we can to step aside and let young people have that space that we might be taking and inadvertently preventing their wisdom from being revealed. So it was an inspirational moment.
One other thing that I would add is that for folks who are donors and looking to figure out how they may invest funds in reconciliation-focused work, I can't make any guarantees, but what I have witnessed over the years is that when you invest in the leadership and capacity development of young people, especially those who are traditionally marginalized and those who are Indigenous, the kind of return on investment is that we get closer and closer to create the kind of place and community that we want to live in and can take more pride in.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. We are running a little bit low on time here, so we're going to take just one more question. Hopefully we can get it done in the next minute or so. And this one is in regards to cultural appropriation. So the question is if I purchase or wear or display artworks done by Indigenous peoples, is that considered cultural appropriation, and how can you learn more about this?
So I'm going to invite Kevin to do a first answer on this.
Awesome.
Thanks, Kris. My kids call me out on this all the time. Actually, they're more sensitive than I am. But my approach is, that's a really tricky question. I have been the recipient of some presents and some gifts from Indigenous friends of mine, which I am so proud of having and showing and using. So I think that's one. I'm not worried in that context of being culturally appropriated, because they've been gifts to me, freely given, encouraged me to use and celebrate. So I'm really pretty cautious in that respect, is that I'm quite happy to work in that realm and have and share and be proud of the gifts I've received. Probably pretty tentative in terms of, and I want to be very respectful of this question, because it's one that I'm still working through and still learning about. But I have a few gifts that I treasure deeply.
What I would add to that piece, thank you for that, Kevin, is that there are a whole host of amazing young Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks who are tackling this very conversation. And so it is as simple as Googling that kind of a question, putting in the context of being in Canada, why might this not be a good idea, and then take the time to read and understand what it is that people are saying. And to be in conversation with others about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kris, for that, and thank you, Kevin, as well for the input there. So we are wrapping up our webinar presentation today, and I believe there is a couple more slides left. Would you like to share, Kris?
Me, yes. Thank you so much for this. Just a reminder and an invitation to folks that tomorrow we are having another webinar. I feel kind of bad that Canada Helps had to deal with my less than savvy behavior today, but hopefully deeper. Sarah, acts of reconciliation based on the year, and the remaining 150 days. And so we're really looking forward to conversation and the ability to invite others into that. And we will follow a similar mode in inviting individuals to think of along a pathway that is both engaging your personal kind of family and community life and connection, and bridging into your professional experiences. So for that, thank you. And just make sure that you know that you can continue to email your questions, your reflections along your journey. Our information is there. Please continue to keep this conversation alive around your boardroom tables, with your families, and in the work that you do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kris. Looks like we're just past 3 o'clock. We're all out of time. So thank you again, Kris, Kevin, and of course to our audience who made it out today to listen to this webinar. We really appreciate it. And of course, to our listeners, please remember to continue the conversation online with the hashtag reconciliation in action. All right. Thanks, everybody.